Thank you very much. If you could show the first slide, please. Right, so what I'm trying to do this afternoon or morning, wherever you are, is present an argument, a hypothesis, which says in the 3 years between 2019 and 2021, so that's 19, 20, and 21, Chile has, if you like, been on a political pendulum that's been swinging to the left. It's been a period of radicalism and deep pain. The hypothesis, of course, I don't know for sure because I can't predict the future, but the hypothesis I'd like to put to you is that the pendulum is moving now in the opposite direction. Radicalism reached a high watermark and is now, if we run from last year, 2022, 2023, 2024, in those 3 years, it will be moving back to the center and perhaps even to the right. And what I'll try and do in this 30-minute talk is give you a sense of how this pendulum swing is taking place in slightly more detail. Could we have the next slide, please? So the starting point of the story, anyway, the one I'm presenting this afternoon, is the social explosion. This is the word that's used in Chile to explain a massive upsurge in street protests that happened after October 2019. So the initial protests, I should say this is a major impact on Chilean society, its economy, at all sorts of its politics, at all sorts of levels. The initial protests began on the 18th of October 2019, when a group of largely secondary school students protested over a relatively small increase in the fares on the Santiago metro. And although this was perhaps a humble beginning, it had the effect of a lighted match in a dry forest. It very, very rapidly set off a much wider protest. It spread geographically from Santiago through to all major cities. It spread in terms of the people participating, from students to workers to lower middle class to teachers to all sorts of trade unions, and it spread as well in terms of the demands. So, you know, initially it was for a reversal of the metro fare, but very rapidly all sorts of social and political demands exploded. The total cost of this was very high. In human terms, there were over 26 people died in the protests. There were billions of dollars of economic losses, and there was what you might call a degradation of social relations, because there was serious violence on both sides. There were some peaceful protesters, but there were also some people who appeared, wearing hoods and throwing Molotov cocktails. The police, civilian force, and the carabineros, the military police force, were accused of widespread human rights violations, blinding people by shooting tear gas straight at their heads. It led to condemnations by human rights groups and by the United Nations. It was a really a terrible time. There's no two ways of explaining it, of describing it. Could we have the next slide, please? So it also has to be said that almost no one in the world of political analysts predicted the explosion. It really took a lot of people, me and many others included, by surprise. Before the social explosion, there was a kind of consensus about Chile. And the consensus was that it had experienced political extremes in the past, most notably the elected Marxist government of President Salvador Allende in 1970 to 73, which was a radical left experiment. and the subsequent military dictatorship, which toppled Allende and led to his death, and ruled the country under General Augusto Pinochet for 17 years, from 1973 to 1990. One interesting feature of the Pinochet dictatorship was that it really sought to apply the so-called Chicago Boys economic theories, essentially of controlling money supply and reducing government spending and going for a smaller state. And that was combined with a very repressive political regime. But the consensus was that after these two extremes, Chile had ended up with some kind of a happy balance. Essentially, what you got in the years between 1990, the end of the Pinochet dictatorship, and 1920, that's 3 decades, was what you might call democratic alternation between center-left and center-right governments, generally cautious approach to social reforms. There were social reforms, but they were done in a fiscally responsible way. And as I think Dee mentioned before, Chile became the poster boy for market-friendly economic development with some social and economic reforms. It was widely regarded as a success experience, and a lot of the metrics were very favorable. If you look at things like GDP per capita, Chile was one of the best performers in Latin America. If you look at economic growth, Chile was up there, at or slightly ahead the average for the region as a whole. However, something was not working, and this kind of duopoly in power didn't, at least from the point of view of a large proportion of the Chilean population, didn't deliver the prosperity it was supposed to deliver, didn't deliver greater equality. There was deep resentment over inequality of wealth and income, didn't deliver on pensions. The privatized pension system has been praised around the world, but the reality is that 7 out of 10 pensioners in Chile now receive a pension that is less than the minimum wage, and they can't actually make ends meet on the level of pensions they're getting right now. There was also a generational change. The current generation of people in their 20s and 30s had no direct experience of the dictatorship. So in some senses, their comparison, their way of comparing is different, and they are more demanding than previous generations may have been. Great, we've got the next slide, which popped up as if by magic. Looking a little bit more closely at this turn to radicalism, the reality is that most political parties in Chile sense that the social explosion was an existential threat. It could, unless controlled in some manner, it could lead to a real breakdown in the Chilean state. So they came together quite early in the process. They came together in November of 2019 and agreed that one way to try and resolve the crisis was to have a new constitution. At that stage, and still, Chile has the 1980 constitution, which was written during the military regime, and for many people is tainted because of its association with a dictatorial government. The constitution also gives particularly clear guidelines on how the private sector should be in the more dominant role in economic activity. So the question put was, how do we change the constitution? The parties agreed a mechanism which started with an entry referendum and was supposed to end with an exit referendum. The entry referendum, which was held in October 2020, basically said, do you want a new constitution, yes or no? And nearly 80%, 78.3% in fact, voted in favor of having a new constitution. There were then subsidiary questions. Do you want the constitution to be written by a directly elected constitutional convention of 155 members, or would you prefer a convention that is half elected, half appointed by Congress? And public opinion was decisively in favor of a specially elected separate convention of 155 seats, perhaps reflecting low levels of credibility and trust in Congress and in the existing political system. So this new constitutional convention was elected in May 2021. Interestingly, its rules stated that any constitutional text had to be approved by 2/3 of the members of the convention. Unfortunately, in retrospect, the right-wing candidates fell short of 1/3 of the seats, meaning they lost their ability to veto changes. The convention was dominated by left-wingers or left-leaning independents. What that meant was that it became quite a radical text, and the center-right of Chilean politics sort of felt unrepresented by what was discussed. Separate to this constitutional process, Chile, of course, had to follow its normal electoral schedule, which called for general elections, congressional and presidential elections, in November, December of 2021. In that election process, the Chilean political scene split, in my opinion, in 4 different ways. Put very crudely, in the past, there were coalitions of what you might call the old left parties versus coalitions of the old right parties. What happened is that both left and right split. So you now got old left, new left, old right, and new right. The old right was represented by a group of conservative parties under the outgoing president, but a new right had emerged, and the new right, largely led by a man called José Antonio Cast, followed a sort of Trumpian path. It declared itself an outsider. It produced right-wing ideas which were seen as being against the established political elite. And it copied Trump in some other quite notable ways. One of the big issues in Trump's election in the US was his promise to build a wall on the US-Mexican border to stop immigrants coming in. Cast's version of this was that he would dig a ditch along the frontier between Bolivia and Chile to stop undocumented immigrants coming into Chile via Bolivia. On the right, Gustavo Boric, currently president, emerged as a representative of the new left. And the new left was basically, it had the concerns of the old left, equality, greater public service initiative, more state-owned companies, higher tax and spend. But it grafted onto the top of that particular interest in identity politics, in indigenous rights, and very, very strongly in environmental protection and energy transition issues. So when you get the elections, in the first round, the new right under Cast is victorious with just over a quarter of the votes, about 27.9%. And second place goes to Boric on only a few percentage points behind. However, on the second round vote, which was held in December, Boric won with a clear majority of Cast of more than 10 percentage points. In fact, Boric won with 55.9% of the vote. So you then have last year, in July, in March 2022, the new Boric government takes office, and in July 2022, the convention completes work on the new constitution. Can we have another slide? So the draft constitution, I think, a high point radicalism in Chile in recent years. Sorry, I'm just, yes. I'm seeing this. Yeah, I've got the the right slide at the right time. Apologies for that. So into this draft constitution went a whole pile of ideas and proposals, which is unkindly but perhaps tellingly described as the longest constitution in the world and the most woke. That, of course, was a right-wing criticism. So what did the draft offer? It offered recognition of universal rights to education, health, and housing. It said that 50% of all jobs in top public institutions had to be held by women, recognized LGBT rights, and most importantly, reversed the idea of subsidiary state, which had been in the 1980 Constitution. So what the 1980 Constitution said was that any activity would be delivered by the private sector as the first option, and the state, the public sector, would only intervene when the private sector could not supply the necessary goods or services for whatever reason. So that was taken away, paving the way for an expansion of the public sector. It also defined Chile as a plurinational state with enhanced rights for indigenous communities. It recognized that the indigenous communities had lost their ancestral lands, promised to return those lands or to pay reparations. And it created a virtually a parallel legal system for indigenous communities, separate from the main legal system enjoyed by the right of the rest of the country. Other features were much increased environmental protection, the concept that nature has rights. So the role of the state is to protect nature from the activities of humans, which was a completely novel concept in Chile. Among the environmental issues, it introduced a ban on mining near glaciers. It said certain public water rights were public non-tradable goods. It eliminated the Senate, which was to be replaced by a House of the Regions, in a way which the right wing believed would reduce democratic checks and balances, and it offered increased devolution to the regions. It should also be said that the process was uneven. By that I mean that on some issues the Constitution entered very, very great detail, and on other issues it was left wide open to interpretation from subsequent legislation that would need to be passed. So a lot of the provisions on mining were very general, broad brush things, but would depend on a renegotiated mining code and a lot of new laws, which would take anywhere between 5 and 10 years to implement. So turning now to what we're calling the not so radical wave, the beginning of that pendulum swing. The most important thing was that the constitution was rejected by 60% of the voters. So a large proportion of Chile saw it as a little bit too radical, a little bit too idealistic and unpractical. And interestingly, for example, in some of the regions of the country with the greatest indigenous population, the no vote, the rejection of the constitution, was one of the highest. So it clearly hadn't won over the voters. Another thing moving Chilean politics back toward the center was that the Boric government basically had a very bad start. And the first difficulty was its approach to the Mapuche conflict in the south of the country, in what's called the Macrozona Sur, and covers the regions of Araucanía and Biobío. Essentially, there's been a long-running low-level insurgency by radical Mapuche groups who are demanding the return of their ancestral lands and using attacks on local settlers. They're attacking sawmills and logging companies. And the right-wing response under the previous government, under the Sebastián Piñera government, was to impose a local state of emergency. During the election campaign, Boric deeply criticized the state of emergency and said that it was too repressive, and what was needed was negotiations on a political solution. Very early on in his presidency, his interior minister, went on a visit to the conflict zone, apparently under the impression that she might be able to start talks immediately and that she would be welcomed and sort of engaged with. Instead, she was met by gunfire, and the Interior Ministry security guard had to remove her from that area quickly. And so she looked or came across as being naive. And the reality is that the Boric government has not really been able to start any meaningful discussions with the Mapuche radical groups, who are really on a sort of separatist track and are not really looking for talks. So Boric has had to basically eat humble pie and roll over the state of emergency every 30 days with a vote in Congress. And what he seemed to be offering as a quick solution to a problem hasn't worked. And his government was seen as being naive, in one word, or just not understanding how difficult and complex political negotiations are. So what's happened is that Boric has received at least two big setbacks. One was the defeat of the new constitution in the referendum, and the other was much more recent. At the end of this last year, he announced a series of presidential pardons for left-wing political activists, which has gone down very badly with the conservative parties, who are intensely critical of it. And in both these cases, Boric has made ministerial changes. And interestingly, the new people he's brought in, on the whole, it's been millennials like him, 30-year-olds leaving ministries and being replaced by older members of Chile's old left. So that kind of indicates that he's realized that he needs more experienced political operators on his side. Next slide, please. Part of the story is appearing in this graph, which shows the disapproval in purple of disapproval rate for Boric in purple, and the approval rate for him in blue. And if you can see right on the right-hand side of this, the disapproval rate has increased systematically during his time in office and is now at an extremely high 70%, while the approval rate has been trending down and is now at 27%. So put bluntly, he's in trouble. Next slide, please. I should also say quickly that the second attempt at constitutional reform, which is now underway, has been intensely engineered in political talks between Boric and the conservative parties to try and ensure success. So just to get some of the key points in it, the political parties have agreed at the beginning of the new process 12 key prior principles which must be respected. And they include establishing what's called a unitary and decentralized state. That means that plurinationalism is pushed to one side, and recognizing indigenous people as, quote, part of the Chilean nation, which is one and indivisible. And that's pushing to the side all these ideas of autonomous legal systems and autonomous legal codes. Another innovation is that the constitution is to be drafted by a commission of 24 experts appointed by Congress. Remember that Congress is more conservative than the president. There will then be a 50-strong, smaller 50-strong elected constitutional council, which will prepare a draft, a final draft, which requires a 60% majority for approval. There are also yet another set of controls. There's a commission of 14 lawyers who will go over the text to insist consistency with Chile's legal traditions. The councillors are to be elected on the 14th of May this year. The electoral system is also going to be slightly more favourable to the centre and the conservative political parties and the way it's run to a particular type of proportional representation. And finally, there will be a new exit referendum due on the 17th of December 2023. Next slide, please. So this leaves us, in my opinion, with three possible scenarios. So starting with the bottom one, I'm basically saying that President Boric may be a busted flush, but that's an outlier scenario. It's one in which he continues having political difficulties. A re-energized right wing gives him a particularly hard time in Congress and in politics in general, and may launch impeachment procedures against him. It should be borne in mind that the left tried to impeach the former right-wing president, Sebastián Piñera. So this isn't a major change for Chilean politics. But I think that's an outlier scenario, not least because nobody controls the 2/3 majority in Congress that you need to impeach a president. So I think the two more likely options, if we discard the completely busted flush scenario, one is that Boric is not busted, but he remains on the defensive. He may even face splits within his own ruling coalition, as the Communist Party and other left-wing parties may wish to dissociate themselves from him, preparing for the next elections in 2026, 2025. So a more positive outcome is that with a new moderate constitution approved at the end of this year or in early 2024, Boric will be able to deliver some progress on reforms. He's already delivered an outline pension reform, which has been broadly positive and which includes private and public sector participation. And it may be that he is able to slightly revert his very bad approval figures. Could we just go a couple of slides forward to the graph we have of presidential approval? It's the one after this, I think. There we are. And I think I just need to close on this. This is basically CADEM, one of Chile's pollsters. And what they've done is they've mapped out the 4 years of the presidential term, and they put in the net approval rating of the former right-wing president, Sebastián Piñera, in purple, the net approval rating of the old left president, Michelle Bachelet, which is in the light green. And then on the left-hand side, in blue, the current approval ratings, net approval ratings of Boric. So what I think this tells us is that all presidents lose popularity. And in Chile's case, recent presidents have had 2 really rough years, followed by a gradual improvement in year 3 and year 4, still ending up a little bit less to where they started out, which is perhaps natural because almost all governments lose popularity over time. The interesting thing here is Boric has done worse comparatively than either Piñera or Bachelet. So the question is whether that curve will continue below the previous presidents, or whether it will eventually recover as they have indicated. I think my time is up exactly now, so I will stop talking. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Over to Kimberley. Okay, Kimberley, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Maybe just a quick introduction from my side. My name's Kimberley Sperrfechter. I work for Capital Economics. For those of you who are not familiar, Capital Economics is one of the world's leading macroeconomic research firms. We have coverage of over 100 economies, as well as financial markets and commodity markets. And I work on our Latin America team, and it's a pleasure to share our views on Chile's economy in this webinar. So I've divided my presentation into three main sections. To set the scene, I'll briefly talk about Chile's post-pandemic recovery and Chile's economic performance during President Boric's first year. I'll then move on to the economic outlook for this year before ending by talking about some of the risks we see around the economic outlook for Chile. So let's start with the post-pandemic recovery. So on this slide, you can see the blue line, which shows Chile's real GDP indexed to Q3 2019. And you can see that following an initial slump as the pandemic broke out, Chile's economy recovered very strongly and swiftly from the pandemic, helped amongst other things by very loose fiscal policy and 3 rounds of pension withdrawals. By the end of 2021, the economic recovery was so strong that the economy was operating well above its pre-pandemic trend, as you can see towards the top right of the chart. Basically, the pre-pandemic trend shows where the economy would have been had it grown at the trend growth rate recorded before the pandemic. However, the strong economic recovery in Chile came at the expense of a buildup of macroeconomic imbalances, such as very strong inflationary pressures and a rapidly widening current account deficit. I'll go into more detail on both of these issues shortly. The strong growth in Chile was not sustainable, and by the time President Boric came into power in early 2022, the economy was at the beginning of an adjustment process that continued throughout last year, with the economy contracting in 2 of the past 3 quarters. And it looks like growth over 2022 as a whole will have slowed to around 2.5%, down from around 12% in 2021. Moving on to the outlook for this year, we think that 3 key factors will determine Chile's economic performance this year. Perhaps we can start with the positive, or the good news, which is that the external backdrop for Chile has become more favorable in recent weeks, following China's shift away from its stringent zero COVID policy and the improving economic picture there. Now, Chile stands to benefit from China's reopening for a couple of reasons. The first one is that, as you can see on this slide, China is by far Chile's most important trading partner. So around 40% of Chile's exports go to China, which is far more than to the US and the EU combined. Now, a large share of Chile's exports to China, and in fact of Chile's total exports, is of course copper, which brings me to the second and related point. This slide shows, the blue line on this slide shows that China's reopening has boosted copper prices. So they're up by over 10% over the past month or so. And we think that a pickup in growth in China will support prices throughout this year. So in total, a pickup in demand from China, as well as high copper prices, should support Chile's external sector over the course of this year. So that was the good news for Chile. The not so good news, however, comes on the domestic front, where we think that 2 key headwinds will weigh on growth. The first one is fiscal policy. Now, this chart shows the change in Chile's government's fiscal structural budget balance, Without going into too much technical detail here, the structural budget balance adjusts the actual budget balance for temporary effects due to changes in the business cycle, and is generally seen as a better indicator of a government's fiscal stance. So on this chart, higher positive numbers indicate a tighter fiscal policy stance and vice versa. So you can see that following a year of very loose fiscal policy during the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, in 2021, fiscal policy was tightened quite substantially last year. And it looks like fiscal policy will stay tight this year too, which will weigh on economic activity. And the second, and arguably bigger headwind, we think will come from still elevated inflation and hence restrictive monetary policy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the consequences of Chile's period of overheating was surging inflation. The grey line in this chart shows Chile's inflation rate, which rose to over 14% in 2022, one of the highest inflation rates across Latin America, apart from Venezuela and Argentina. The surge in inflation prompted Chile's central bank to embark on one of the most aggressive monetary tightening cycles in the emerging world. It raised its policy rate by a cumulative of over 10 percentage points to 11.25%. Now, the good news, as you can see on this chart, is that inflation has peaked and should decline over the coming months. However, we do expect inflation to stay above the central bank's 3% inflation target throughout this year, which is one of the reasons why we expect interest rates to remain very high by past standards this year. We've done extensive analysis and modeling on how changes in interest rates affect the real economy, and the following slide shows our findings for Chile. So the blue line shows Chile's private sector interest service ratio. It sounds like a very complicated word, but essentially it shows how much of their income household and corporate spend on interest payments. And as you can see, in the decade leading up to the pandemic, these payments amounted to between 8 and 9% of incomes. However, we think that the central bank's aggressive monetary tightening cycle will take the number closer to around 16% this year. Now, in Chile, it's not just the sheer size of the increase that's worrying. It's also the fact that household savings are very low. So it's quite likely that households will cut back on spending elsewhere to meet these higher interest payments, and hence further large falls in consumption seem quite likely over the coming quarters. So in terms of what all of this means for growth in Chile this year, we think that tight fiscal policy and especially the impact of higher interest rates will outweigh the benefits from China's reopening and will cause Chile's economy to contract by around 1% over 2023 as a whole, as you can see on this slide. I'd now like to spend a bit of time talking about some of the risks we see around the outlook for Chile. The first one being Chile's worryingly large current account deficit. Just a quick explanation here. A country's current account is essentially the difference between what it exports and what it imports. So if a country imports more than it exports, which is the case for Chile, it'll run a current account deficit. The key here is that a current account deficit needs to be financed by foreign capital inflows. So the larger a country's deficit, the larger its dependence on foreign capital inflows. And in emerging markets, the rule of thumb is that a deficit of around 5% of GDP or larger is generally where we economists start getting worried. So as you can see on this slide, Chile's current account deficit has widened quite sharply over the past 1.5 years or so due to a combination of factors. You first had the very strong economic recovery that led to a surge in demand for imports. And then last year you had the surge in energy prices following the war in Ukraine. So these two factors pushed Chile's current account deficit to around 10% of GDP towards the end of last year, which is one of the largest deficits in the emerging world. We do think that the deficit will narrow over the course of this year as growth and hence demand for imports slows and copper prices are elevated, but we still expect it to stay above the 5% threshold I mentioned earlier throughout this year. This means that Chile will remain highly reliant on foreign capital inflows, and as a result, the Chilean peso is very vulnerable to further sharp falls if global risk appetite deteriorates and investors pull their money out of Chile. And I think events last year illustrate quite clearly where the risks lie. So this slide shows the Chilean peso versus the US dollar. And you can see that when risk appetite soured in the summer of 2022, investors pulled their money out of Chile, and that caused the peso to fall quite sharply. And the falls were so sharp and disorderly that the central bank intervened by launching an FX intervention program to support the peso. Now, the peso has appreciated recently, appreciated against the dollar recently, but I think as long as the current account deficit stays worryingly large, renewed falls in the peso remain a key risk. One of the factors that potentially could trigger a renewed sell-off is the constitutional process, which brings me to the second risk we see for the outlook for Chile. Now, Andrew has covered the political implications of the new constitution, and I'd like to add some points on the economic implications. I think it's quite likely that the new constitutional process will lead to a more slimlined and probably moderate charter. But even if that's the case, there could still be some quite substantial economic implications. For one, it's quite likely that the new constitution still enshrines a larger role for the state in the economy, especially when it comes to the provision of services to the public. Now, I don't think that necessarily is a bad thing, because better education and healthcare, for example, could improve skills in Chile and could also lead to an increase in productivity. Having said that, though, these provisions would inevitably come at a fiscal cost, which will either need to be financed by higher taxes or will result in larger budget deficits. If the Boric administration decides to fund higher spending by raising taxes, I think the risk is that these tax hikes are targeted towards businesses, which already shoulder quite a large share of the tax burden in Chile. If that's the case, then that could potentially make Chile's overall business environment less attractive and in turn lead to reduced investment. On the other hand, if higher public spending results in larger budget deficits, which we think is quite likely, that will have negative implications on Chile's debt trajectory. This slide shows Chile's public debt as a share of GDP. It's currently at around 36%, which is quite low compared to other countries in the region. So, for example, in Brazil, the ratio's at around 80%, and in Mexico at around 50%. In Chile, however, it's the trajectory that we're worried about. As you can see, we expect the ratio to steadily rise over the coming years, which could raise sovereign debt risks in the medium term. So I guess the upshot here is that obviously a lot will depend on what's in the charter and if the charter is ultimately approved. But we think that the risks are tilted towards a less favorable business environment, larger budget deficits, and a rising debt ratio. That was our view on Chile in a nutshell. I'd like to wrap up by summarizing my presentation in 3 key points. The first one being that this year will be a challenging year economically for Chile, in which we expect GDP to contract by around 1%. Secondly, Chile's large current account deficit and hence its dependency on foreign capital inflows leave the peso vulnerable to renewed sharp falls. And finally, in terms of the implications of a new constitution, we think that the state is likely to play a larger role in the economy going forward, and the risks are tilted towards a less favorable business environment, lower investment, and large budget deficits. I think this is my time's up. I hope this presentation gave you an idea of the outlook for Chile and some of the challenges Chile faces over the coming, or this year and next.
Thank you very much. That was excellent, and thank you for sticking to time. Andre, if you can just come to the other slides, to the last ones. We have a couple of questions, but first of all, I'd just like Guy, perhaps if you have any comments or questions yourself.
Sure, thank you very much, and thank you, Kimberly and Andrew, for a fascinating and highly informative description, coverage of what's going on in Chile. You know, I would love to have some thoughts from either of you, even though it's a bit outside of scope, of how this relates to what's going on in other neighboring countries, because I tend to see these things as all of a piece. And I just wondered if either of you has anything that you would offer on how the situation in Chile relates to, is similar to, or different from what's going on in Peru, what's going on in Brazil, Argentina, you know, the neighboring countries. Any thoughts?
Andrew?
Yes. My thought is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Latino Barometro opinion polls, which basically look at the state of health of democracy in Latin America, and which over the last 3 or 4 years have been deeply depressing. What they seem to be saying is that trust in democracy has reduced, trust in institutions has also gone down, and there are deep concerns over issues like corruption and crime. Now, I think you can fairly say that although Latin America is very, very diverse, all Latin American countries have suffered this kind of democratic malaise or democratic deficit quite acutely. The difference, I think, is a question of degree. So in the 1970s, we were accustomed to the idea of the Latin American military coup. There are now much fewer military coups, but there are serious crises to do with backsliding on democratic values. So if you look at Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro, there have been many, many cases where there are conflicts between the executive and the judiciary, between the executive and Congress, and there is a sense of a kind of new authoritarianism, which can be of the left or of the right, because there have been many similar conflicts in Mexico involving the government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Now, in this general context, I think Chile still looks good by comparison. While it has suffered serious setbacks, and the social explosion was a serious setback, the democratic institutions seem to be working in a better way than in neighboring countries, not only Brazil, maybe Peru, which has had, 6 presidents in 5 years. Chile still shows greater solidity. So I think that's kind of the comparison I'd keep my eye on.
Okay, we're now getting some more questions in. We'll start with the first one and then work our way down. Could you say something about the stability of the ruling coalition and how Boric plans to tackle the Mapuche challenge in the south? Andrew?
I think the coalition is stable for now. I think it's got about a year, and if Boric doesn't have some kind of recovery, you may see the ruling coalition losing some members. In terms of the Mapuche conflict, I find it very hard to see a way forward because the government, the Boric government, has favored the idea of some reforms, and its supporters, through the failed constitution, had a whole, if you like, offer to do with autonomy and giving greater powers to the region to allow the Mapuche community to reposition itself within Chile. And it seems that, the constitution has been rejected, so that kind of indigenous autonomy is not going to be on the table in the way it was. And secondly, the Mapuche radicals, who are only a very small proportion of the community, show no interest in negotiating at all. So it's very hard to see progress.
Okay, we'll come back to economic policy in a minute. How do you see US and Chinese influence playing out in Chile?
I think Chile will try and remain equidistant. It is very economically dependent on China because that's its main copper export market, but it has traditionally good relations with the US. And like other Latin American countries, it will try and steer some sort of middle course between the two.
Okay, and someone at Polly has asked more details on the two parts in the right wing, the old and the new, and also are Trumpist strategies being employed in Chile, and what are the implications?
I'm not sure if I've understood that correctly.
The old and the new part of the right wing.
I think there is a clear division between Chile Vamos, the traditional right-wing coalition with the parties UDI and Renovación Nacional, and the CAST group. This poses, I think, the interesting issue is they will be looking at the next elections, and will they be able to come together, because they need to come together to be able to get a majority of the vote. In some ways, it's the same dilemma that the left faces. I think we're going to see more Trumpian politics in Chile because there is a sector of the population which feels angry and disaffected and is susceptible to a kind of nationalist right-wing appeal and anti-establishment position.
Okay, and Kimberley, perhaps you can comment on what Chile's economic policy, what should Chile be doing in its economic policy to meet some of the needs of the caused by the popular explosion?
Yeah, I think one of the most likely outcomes is that spending on provision of public services such as education, healthcare, and spending will increase just to meet people's demand. I mean, some of these demands were at the core of the protests in 2019, which Andrew mentioned earlier. So I think in order to appease people and to perhaps also shore up its popularity, it might increase spending. I think the risk here is, though, that, as I mentioned earlier, higher public spending puts public finances under strain. Currently, the public finances in Chile are still quite healthy, but I think over the near term, the risk is that continually higher spending leads to an increase in the public debt ratio over the coming years, which then could raise sovereign debt risks in the medium term.
Okay, and Kimberley, perhaps Kimberley can also comment on China's free in Chile and other countries in the region.
Yeah, I haven't looked at the Belt and Road Initiative in Chile in a lot of detail, but China is a very important player for Chile. So especially China's property sector is a large driver of demand for Chilean exports. Yeah, I think as Andrew mentioned, I think Chile will is kind of in a different situation where they want to keep China on board, but at the same time they don't want to ruin the relationship with the US. So I think that's one of the key struggles for the Boric administration to deal with that, and perhaps administrations that come into power afterwards.
Okay, Andrew, perhaps you can just comment on the business environment and what companies and investors are going to have to get used to in Chile. Because obviously one is going to see the constitution, perhaps a more moderate version, but it's not going to, the government will still push for some changes on the environment, etc., which aren't necessarily going to be overly radical, but there will be change, yeah?
Yes, I think just to give a little bit of detail, there's been an ongoing debate throughout the year about tax reform, and specifically tax reform of the mining industry. And the government has started out with the proposal of a kind of windfall tax type royalty where mining companies would pay on a sliding scale depending on changes in the copper price. The private sector and private mines did not like the idea at all, and have been negotiating for something a little less onerous. They say that the original government proposal would reduce profits after tax by up to 20 percentage points. The government has begun to concede a little, and the latest version of this tax is that it'll be a flat 1% royalty tax on mining sales. I think the wider issue, throwing in a separate thought perhaps, a lot of people say Chile has a fantastic long-term opportunity, which is the expansion, it's the energy transition at a global level and the expansion of electric vehicles, which will lead to much greater demand for copper and other key minerals that go into the new EV cars and so on. So the issue is to meet that wonderful future opportunity. Chile needs mining companies to invest now in big mining projects. However, the mining companies and the private sector as a whole is very, very cautious and unwilling to invest large amounts until the constitutional reforms are finalized, which will take all of this year at the very best, and subsequent legislation following on the constitutional reforms gives them a better idea of what the business environment is going to be like and what tax levels are going to be like. So there is a danger that in these years of constitutional reform negotiations, there is an investment shortfall which will show up in 5 to 10 years' time when demand for copper is ramping up because of the energy transition.
Excellent. I think that's a very good way to end on hopefully an optimistic note for Chile.
One point, Charles, that I'd
Yeah.
love to just mention.
Yeah.
It relates to Andrew's citation of the information from the Latin American Barometer. And I think this is just a macro, truly macro, holistic political point. But all of the things that you mentioned, decline in trust of institutions, decline of democracy, are arguably, as relevant for other parts of the world as they are for Latin America, including, by the way, the United States and large parts of Europe. And, I think that we're in a different regime in terms of political evolution, and that, it's easy, I think, to fall into the trap that, well, Latin America's always had political problems and it's just another example, what's going on now. I think it has a different tenor. And I say that in part because I do think it relates to change going on in the rest of the world. So it's not just more of the same. It's something else as well. And the question that I would have is for both of you. First of all, any thoughts on that? But secondly, do you see the kind of political violence of 2019 returning in Chile in any foreseeable near future scenario?
Andrew?
My short answer on political violence is I don't see it returning quickly, but I don't rule it out on a 2, 3, 4 year perspective. I think that's still a possibility. And I agree with what you say about the backsliding on democracy being a global problem. I think that will continue sort of affecting Latin American countries.
Kimberley, anything else to say?
I don't think I have anything to add from an economic point of view on that.
Okay. All right, fine. Okay, I think we're going to leave it there.